Chapter 2. Your chances of getting a mate you'll like. First, you might ask, what are your chances of getting a mate of any kind? If you are a man and are interested, you can almost 100% be certain you will marry. More than 10% of the eligible men today won't marry, but that will largely be due to the fact that they prefer to remain bachelors. If you are a girl, the chances that you will marry are not quite as good. At the start of the war, about 13% of the girls were failing to marry. The prospect now is that for several years after the war, about 14 or 15% will fail. It will be a good market for men. Girls in some age brackets will be hit harder than others, and we sympathize with the girls past 25 who feel they were passing the peak of the eligibility curve for marriage while many of the best male prospects were still away in the armed forces. These girls have cause for concern. The surplus of grown women over men, which is something new in our population, has been increased by war casualties, and the number of men who prefer bachelorhood is apt to increase from 10% at present to perhaps 15% because the older a single man becomes, the less he thinks about marriage. This war has created a great many old single men. It is estimated that between 2 million and 5 million of the marriageable women in America today will never marry. Sociologists are already worrying about this lost generation of our women between 20 and 35, with those in their late 20s presumably hit the hardest. You may ask when a girl reaches the peak of her eligibility for marriage. In normal years, the peak is between 19 and 21, and the curve declines markedly after the 25th birthday. Here are the chances for men and women to marry by certain ages. The odds for men show that only about 1 in 10 marries before he is 21, 1 in 3 marry at ages 21 to 25, about 3 to 10 marry between 25 and 30, and about 1 in 10 marries between 30 and 35. A factor unfavorable to the older girls past 25 is that as men become older, they tend to marry increasingly younger girls. Normally, for example, a man of 25 will marry a girl of 22, whereas a man of 31 will probably marry a girl of 25. That's why girls in the present 25 to 35 group may be hardest hit by the war. One encouraging possibility, however, is that veterans are looking for more wisdom and maturity in their brides than civilians of the same age usually do. There have been a good many reports of veterans marrying girls 5 and 10 years their senior. Idealistically, the best age for a girl to marry is from 21 to 27, and for a man from 25 to 30. Of all women who do marry, about 56% are married by their 25th birthday, about 84% by their 30th birthday, and about 95% by their 35th birthday. After 35, a woman has to get busy if she wants to marry. 35 is when an unmarried woman can no longer consider herself a young maid. The marriage prospects for girls today would not be quite so unfavorable if our men would all seek mates. As it is, with from 10 to 15% preferring to remain single, at least 1 million girls will not have an opportunity to marry. As far as we can gather, the reason behind this masculine perversity is that boys, unlike girls, are not indoctrinated with the idea that marriage should be one of their big goals in life. But why, you may ask, are there more eligible girls than men in America? The imbalance caused by the war is not the only reason. Here are some other reasons for the shortage of males that looms. Men die younger than women. The weaker sex is actually the tougher sex when it comes to reaching a ripe old age. Our male surplus of immigrants has been about used up. Immigration is a form of pioneering and has been considered primarily a task of men. When the flow of immigrants was heavy, it accounted for many thousands of our male surplus. Now the flow has dwindled to a trickle. America is no longer a young nation, and of course the older our population becomes, the more feminine it becomes for the reasons mentioned above. There are still more boy babies born in America than girl babies, about 105 boys per 100 girls, but because the males die faster, both by natural causes and by accidents, the males slip into the minority now after the age of 25. War affects marriage in very peculiar ways. During the initial phase of World War II, marriages increased at a spectacular rate. This probably was due to the increasing prosperity. Prosperity increases both marriages and divorces, and by the psychological incentives to mate as a result of war. These include not only the impulses to elude the draft, but the yearning of a boy to keep some visible contact with home, and the yearning of the girl to have some concrete commitment from a man when so many of them were leaving the community to go to war. By 1942, 1,800,000 marriages took place in the country, the highest number in history. Then the rate started dropping off as men became more scarce, so that by 1944, the number of marriages was only 1,440,000. In 1945, the trend was changing. Judging from events after World War I, the post-war years will see a spurt in marriages that may take the rate to nearly 2 million a year for a couple of years. But that won't change the fact that a good many girls will still not have a chance to marry. But even if you do marry, what are the chances you will get a mate you like? The answer depends a great deal on who you are. We can assure you that such mates will not come automatically. Right now, there are at least 1 million married couples who are waiting to get a divorce. Millions of other couples tolerate each other but are not happy by any standards we could apply to them. Many of the unsuccessful matches were war marriages, hastily made. A study made after the First War of marriages hastily contracted from 1916 to 1920 showed that those marriages were less happy for both men and women than those contracted before the war. Another study showed that the marriages undertaken immediately after men came back from World War I were not, on an average, as happy as they would have been normally. The same will be true for the many of the hurriedly contracted marriages in 1946 and 1947. These studies substantiate the fact that much greater likelihood of mismating exists when marriages are hastily contracted, and especially when contracted at a time of high emotional excitement. As this book is written, 1 marriage in 5 is ending in divorce, and as we get further into the post-war years, the rate will probably rise to at least 1 failure in every 4 marriages. Furthermore, if the long-range trends continue, the divorce rate will be 1 divorce for every 2 marriages by 1975. Hollywood stars and physicians in some states are already close to that rate. That's pretty depressing to contemplate when you consider that 15 years ago, the rate was 1 failure in 14 marriages. Perhaps the one encouraging aspect of the growing male shortage is that it may slow down the divorce rate. Divorces occur most frequently when men are plentiful. When men are scarce, women tend to hang on to what they have and need to be provoked before they will fly off to Reno. Why is the divorce rate rising at such an ominous rate? Admittedly, there are deeper reasons than the war for the trend. Civilization is becoming more complex, puts greater strains and stresses on marriage. Unhappy married couples are not held together as much as they used to be by fears inspired by hell and damnation religion. Our movies and soap operas present marriage in a fantastically unreal light. Finally, it seems that our standards for marriage happiness are now so low that people assume a couple is happy as long as the husband doesn't beat his wife openly. You may be interested to know that all the trends indicate that more divorced men remarry than do divorced women, in spite of the fact that each divorce separates a couple. In 1940, there were twice as many feminine divorcees who had not remarried as there were unmarried male divorces. The records also disclose the interesting fact that only about 10% of the women getting divorces ask alimony, and that only 6% get it. Your chances of getting a mate you will like are even affected by your sex. If you are a girl, your chances are not as good as if you were a man. This is largely due to the fact that a girl cannot gracefully take the initiative in stalking a mate who looks attractive to her. Women enjoy being pursued, but men still don't. They don't want anything that seems too easy to win. If the woman takes the initiative, at least if she takes it conspicuously, the world will think her aggressive and unladylike. She will be thought common, for instance, if she goes to the phone and asks a boy for a date, or if she proposes marriage. Despite the progress of feminine emancipation during this century, and especially during World War II, this is still a man's world, and probably feminism will be on the defensive after the war, when the veterans return, and many of the women will be expected to retire gracefully to the kitchens. At any rate, our present moral standards apparently make it much more difficult for a girl to win some possible mate who interests her than it is for a man. Few of our younger people realize it, but there are also a host of other factors that often limit the number of acceptable mates they are able to choose from. Marriage counselors use the phrase assortative mating to describe the way two people of the opposite sex pair up on the basis of being pretty much like each other and living in much the same neighborhood. The term was first used to describe the way animals mate on the basis of similar size and color. Today's men and girls often set up criteria in selecting a mate that narrows their possible choices more than they realize. A man often has some pretty specific ideas on the kind of girl he wants to marry, and the girl has similar ideas about her husband-to-be. The chances of a person getting a mate he will like becomes less and less as he raises his qualifications. In the early days of American life, when civilization was much simpler than it is today, and when people differed less in their social and economic status, a girl or man usually could find among 5 acquaintances someone suitable for marriage. The situation is decidedly different today. One authority in this field estimates that a girl, for example, needs to know 20 or 25 young men in order to find that she may have sufficient range to find someone eligible for her needs. Let's look at the little considered factors that limit your choice. How educated must your mate be? All the studies that have been made of marriage show that as one's educational level rises, an individual tends more and more to make a rational and less emotional choice of a mate. The educated man has a greater range of choice than the educated woman, because he is much more willing to marry under his educational level, whereas a woman, again for reasons of prestige, is usually reluctant to do so. If she goes to college, she feels she has no choice but to restrict her selection to college men, by so confining herself and by leading a more cloistered life than her cousin who never went past high school. A college girl definitely reduces her chances of marrying. Whereas in the past nearly 90% of our women have married, it is estimated that only about 75% of college women have married. How much money must you have? If you have money yourself or have it in your family, you are more apt to make a hard-headed choice for a mate than one who has little money. He will marry more spontaneously. If you think back, you may remember that during the Depression of 1929 to 33, people of high economic status postponed marrying until more stable times, whereas the people with small incomes went right on marrying, if they could possibly manage it. Generally, people tend to marry pretty much into their own economic class. The girl who was raised in the poor section of town and is now working as a sales clerk in a 5 and 10 store may yearn to marry a sophisticated man from a wealthy family, but that is not the kind of mate she needs. It is doubtful she could be happy with him because their differences are too great. There are exceptions, of course. Occasionally we read about and cheer a news report of a modern Cinderella, but we usually frown when we read of the opposite, of a rich girl marrying a poor man. That somehow seems abnormal to us. The girl may lose caste. A man of moderate means who himself married a debutante expressed his views on such arrangements, however, when he said to us, "Never marry for money, but it's just as easy to fall in love with a rich girl." How about the mate's national background and religion? Are you an American of Italian extraction who would not consider marrying a girl of Swedish background? Are you a Catholic who would not think of marrying anyone but another Catholic? You may have good reasons for your exclusiveness, but the fact remains that your field has been narrowed. How is your job affecting your prospects? People tend to marry mates who live conveniently near and have similar interests. About a fifth of all married couples meet each other at work. A school teacher, for example, is much more likely to know school teachers of the opposite sex than to know physicians of the opposite sex. Yet many occupations are such that far more of one sex enter them than is true of the other. For example, there are normally nearly 5 women teachers to 1 man teacher, 7 or 8 feminine librarians to 1 male librarian, some 25 or 30 women in nursing to each man in somewhat similar work. Is it any wonder that the rate of marriage among school teachers, librarians, and among nurses is much lower than average? Girls who choose nursing for a career cut their marriage prospects by at least 50%. Finally, how is geography affecting your prospect for mates? Though the conditions of World War II broadened the matrimonial horizon of many men and girls as they moved about the country, the fact remains that location is an important factor in confining the choice of millions of people. In a study of several thousand marriages in Philadelphia, it was discovered that 4 out of 5 young people there selected their mates from within their own city. In 1 out of 3 of their marriages, the couple had lived within 5 blocks of each other before marriage. Looking at the country as a whole, some towns and sections offer better marriage prospects than others. This is a little-known fact. For example, the cities of New England offer the poorest possibilities for young women to marry out of any section of the country. This is mainly because the textile industries in that area attract so many more women than men. Of the 30 United States cities offering the poorest opportunities for marriage for women, 22 are in New England. And of the 30 offering the best opportunities for women, about half are in Michigan, Ohio, and northern Indiana, where the automotive industries, which attract far more men than women, are located. It is interesting to note that during World War II, the marriage rate increased very rapidly in areas with new war industries requiring a great number of men: shipbuilding, aircraft, metalworking. In Baltimore, the marriage rate went up nearly 40%. In Hartford, important in aviation, it went up 25%. Areas that considerably favor girls by providing a surplus of eligible men are the Far West and the Southwest, particularly Texas. The Deep South is much less favorable. Where does your state stand on the ratio of eligible men to eligible women? The typical American male marries at about 25.5, and the typical female at 22.5, or about 3 years earlier. Thus perhaps the fairest comparison would be to take the single men between 23 and 28, and the single women between 20 and 25. The following table shows how each state rates in such a comparison. It is based on the 1940 census. Nevada leads the list as the paradise for girls, since there are 177 men there for each 100 girls. At the other end of the scale, Rhode Island is overpopulated with females, due to its many textile mills, and so is an unpromising place for girls to find a mate, but a fine place for men. There are 100 girls for every 83 men. Notice that all of the first 9 states offering the best possibilities for girls are in the West, and that the 5 most favorable states for men are in the East. Perhaps the old slogan, "Go West, young man, go West," might be revised to read, "Go East, young man, go West, young woman." There is another age range that needs consideration. That is, the groups who have not married by the time most people marry. These groups are the men between 30 and 35, and girls between 25 and 30. Both these groups need to get busy because they face a very definite possibility of becoming crusty old bachelors or disgruntled spinsters. Since men past 30 tend to marry women who are more than 3 years younger than themselves, it might be valid to compare the number of girls 25 to 30 to the men 30 to 35. Here again, the West is the great land of opportunity for girls, while the Carolinas and the New England textile states are still less inviting to girls. One interesting thing is that in the southern states of Kentucky, Virginia, and Louisiana, a girl's ratio is pretty favorable up until 25 years, but after that they become definitely not good places to find a husband. If we take all single men as a whole and compare them to single women, without regard to age, here's how the states seem to shape up. The 10 best for women and poorest for men: Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Washington, Arizona, California, North Dakota, Oregon, South Dakota, Nevada. The 10 poorest for women and best for men: Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina, Missouri. Of the 10 best states for women, all are west of the Mississippi, and of the best states for men, all but one is east of the Mississippi. While the states themselves are pretty good guides as to where to go to pick up a mate, the location within a particular state may be of even greater importance. For example, in Virginia, Norfolk rates as a fine place for a girl to find a husband, but Richmond rates way down on the scale. Here is a comparison of the number of white single girls in the 25 to 30 age group and of the white single men aged 30 to 35 in our 106 cities having a population of 50,000 or more. In such a comparison, incidentally, virtually all of our cities show a surplus of older girls over older men, when those two age groups are compared. Here, however, we are interested only in the relative desirability of cities. Girls on farms and in small towns may fret to get to the big cities, but their chances of marrying will be better in their rural communities, where there are 104 men for every 100 women, than in cities where the ratio is 96 men per 100 girls. Women's colleges and all-male colleges may have their advantages educationally, but they can deprive you of the chance for normal contacts with the opposite sex, and thus reduce your chances of marrying. To get a fairly accurate idea of just what your marriage expectancy is, considering all factors, you should take the test reproduced with this chapter on what is your marriage expectancy. If your marriage expectancy rating is low, do not become pessimistic. That's the worst thing that could happen. Rather, decide what you want in a mate. Find where such a mate exists. Establish friendships that will lead to introductions. Make yourself attractive to possible mates by studying their wants and needs and appearing to fill them. This is a formula that will get almost anyone a mate if he or she really wants one.